Hello friends, my name is Ian and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be continuing our last video where we started talking about the 3-act story structure and talk more specifically about Act 1. Act 1 is known as the setup because you are setting everything else up for the remainder of your story. This can also be seen as making promises for what will come later in the story. But no matter what idea you subscribe to about what Act 1 is, it's still a very important part of what you're writing. With that being said, let's get into it. So what does Act 1 do or mean to accomplish? And what are the things you have to have within Act 1? Act 1 needs to hook your readers, because if they're not hooked, they won't stay. It sets up the rest of the story, like I've already mentioned. It has to introduce the protagonist and everything about them, from their internal struggle to what they do on a daily basis. It also introduces the setting and allows you to show some of the world before the rest of the story kicks off, where you might see more of it. It also introduces the theme, and a reader might not be able to completely grab the theme right away, and that's okay. It also sets the tone, and the tone cannot and should not be changed at all. If your tone is a serious, dark fantasy, you're going to lose the reader if you try to do something funny and humorous. It's not going to fit. Okay, so in the last video, we talked about each section of the 3-act story structure and how you should be going about using it. In this video, we're gonna go more in depth of, as you can guess, the first act. So we're going to start at the beginning. Literally. The beginning, or the hook. The hook is where you need to grab your reader's attention, or like I said, they will not stay with the story. Attention spans have unfortunately shrunk in recent years, so grabbing and keeping your reader's attention is of utmost importance. They will just as easily put the book down as they picked it up. You should introduce the protagonist at this point, and maybe one or two other characters. You want to have introduced their internal struggle, their life, their daily routine, and where they live should all be introduced within the hook. The tone should also be set during this time. A hook should not be too long and dragged out. While it's good to grab the reader's attention, it's important that you move on from the hook as soon as you can. You can have a couple scenes in between each plot point to add more substance to the first act. The hook sets up the status quo. However, your readers are smart enough to know that at some point something is going to snap, and that is going to come very soon. So let's get into an example, and I'm going to be using Star Wars for this example, as it uses the 3-act story structure very well. So the hook of Star Wars. That's when you open up when a small starship is being chased and shot at by a much larger spaceship. When the large ship manages to capture the small ship, a small battle takes place on the smaller ship when the Imperials board from their own. The rebels try to repel the Empire. This gets your attention immediately, because you want to know why this ship is being attacked. You later learn that they're looking for the plans of a Death Star, and these plans were given by Princess Leia to R2-D2 and sent on an escape pod. It's then, after a small adventure with the droids, R2-D2 and C-3PO, on the desert planet of Tatooine, that you finally meet the protagonist, Luke Skywalker. We wonder what Luke is going to do because he just seems to be living a normal life as a moisture farmer. So in Act 1, make sure to ask yourself, how are you able to grab your reader's attention? What will get them invested into the narrative? What will the protagonist's character arc look like? Now we're going to move on to the inciting incident. This is the catalyst that sends your protagonist down a path. This is the first major beat and where the main part of the story tends to begin. The protagonist's status quo is interrupted, and they're thrust out of their comfort zone into a new situation. Life for the protagonist will never be the same. The inciting incident itself should be very quick. The inciting incident can be anything from a few paragraphs to the entire chapter. However, I recommend having a small part of that chapter be the actual inciting incident. However, this doesn't have to be anything massive. It could be something as simple as something that pushes the protagonist forward. Remember, the only thing that the inciting incident has to do is push the character out of their comfort zone. There will typically be a few scenes between the hook and the inciting incident. However, you don't have to follow that. You could put your hook right before your inciting incident, and the inciting incident could be in that first chapter, in that first scene. And if that's how it goes, perfectly fine. It works for your story, there you go. That's sort of how it worked in Star Wars. It comes when Luke is cleaning R2-D2 and finds a stuck hologram in the droid. And you hear the iconic line, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." But that's all that you get. Later, R2-D2 runs away to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke chases after him because he is worried he will get in trouble with his aunt and uncle who have raised him since birth. This is what pushes him out of his comfort zone because he wasn't prepared to run out and look for the droid. For the inciting incident, ask yourself these questions. How does this force the protagonist out of their comfort zone? What does it mean for the protagonist and the world around them? And now we get to the build-up. In the build-up, the final parts of the narrative are put into place, and the tension starts to climb. The consequences of the inciting incident happen, and the protagonist has to face those. When writing the build-up, you still have to make sure the plot pushes ahead. You want to keep building that tension as this section goes on. The build-up compared to the other 3 plot points is the only point in Act 1 where it encompasses the entire part that you write for the build-up. You may also include information you find important to the plot here, but make sure you don't start info dumping. In the build-up, the protagonist will typically push away the call to action and initially refuse it. They plan on returning to their normal life. They feel like they can't do something or something is holding them back from it. So they go back to what feels safe to them. However, something is going to force them to make that decision. Let's return back to our example of Star Wars. The buildup happens when a group of Tusken Raiders attack Luke. Obi-Wan then rescues Luke and brings him back to his hut. This is where Luke learns about the Force and learns about his father having been a Jedi once. He also learns that he has the ability to become a Jedi because he can control the Force. They also learn the entire situation of what's happening to Princess Leia. Obi-Wan decides to go to Alderaan to get these plans to her father on Alderaan. Obi-Wan offers to take Luke with him to teach him the ways of the Force. However, Luke initially refuses because he still feels like he has things to do on the planet, and he has to stay to help his uncle and aunt on the moisture farm. On the way home, however, Luke and Obi-Wan run into the sand crawler, and the Jawas on it are slaughtered. These are the same Jawas that sold Luke and his aunt and uncle R2 and C-3PO. Here they deduce that they must have been looking for the droids because of what R2 contained. Luke then grabs his speeder and rushes home because he knew that if they tracked down R2 and 3PO, they'd be able to track them to who they sold them to. In the build-up for Star Wars, you can see the rise of tension until it reaches its highest in Act 1. This is not the highest the tension will climb throughout the story. This is just getting to the highest point in the first act. For the build-up, make sure to ask these questions. How can you keep raising the stakes and keeping your reader interested during this time frame? What initially prevents the protagonist from following the call to action? And now you get to the first plot point. After the protagonist initially refuses the call to action from the inciting incident, an event comes and happens which forces the protagonist to leave their old life behind and pursue that call to action and their new goal. The protagonist cannot go back on this decision to chase that goal. This is a big turning point for the story itself. Their life has been entirely thrown to the wayside, and their inner struggle is put on full display here. Without this first plot point, the story will not go forward, and the narrative itself will stagnate. Go into the main conflict with a bang, and don't leave your readers hanging. And for our last example, you guessed it. We're going right back into Star Wars. Luke arrives home and sees it on fire, or at least smoking. At the front door, both his aunt and uncle are dead. His caretakers were dead. He had nowhere else to go. He had nothing to go back to. Luke goes back to Obi-Wan and says that he'll go with him. He has nothing else here on Tatooine. Ask yourself what causes the protagonist to leave their old life behind and chase that new goal. Why is it important to the character? How does this push their character arc forward? And now let's get into some extra tips that might help you write the first act. The first one is that many scenes make up the first act. It is not 4 scenes. It does not have one scene for the hook, one scene for the inciting incident, one scene for the build-up, and one scene for the first plot point, and ends there. That is not how the first act should be written, as that will give you very little to go off on. Act 1 is all about making promises to the reader. Everything that you set up is a promise to the reader. You have to go through with that. But Act 1 is all about making these promises. If you do not fulfill these promises later, then your reader might feel cheated. Don't worry about getting Act 1 right the first time, or even the second time. The setup can be easy for you, but it can also be hard for you. If you do not get it your first time around, then try again later. If done well, the first act will have your readers engaged and ready to go further into your narrative. Act 1 takes roughly 25% of your narrative. So try your best to keep Act 1 within the first 25% of the story. This gives you plenty of time to set everything in motion, but it doesn't overdo what the setup has and should be doing. Make sure all of this, especially the first plot point, are important to the character. The plot is just as important as the character. However, without the plot being important to the character, then no one is going to feel attached to the plot or the character. And that's going to about do it for this video. I hope this helped you understand how to write Act 1 a little bit better. And if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as I post videos like this every Sunday. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next week. As always, never stop writing. Bye!